And fourthly, look for a person, and this is the fourth quality which is necessary, look for a person who follows a system which is consistent with the tradition. There are methodologies out there that completely dismiss the authority of the Prophet ﷺ. An approach dismissive of the hadith tradition. And there are others who don't acknowledge any concept of established scholarly consensus, ijma'. They say, well, all the scholars agreed. I don't care. I want to interpret the Quran like this. I want to come up with an interpretation which is unprecedented, but for me this is a valid interpretation. I don't care about scholarship. I don't care about agreement of the Muslim Ummah. And yet there are others who are malicious towards many of the prominent Sahaba. In those areas where the basis and the system is of a deviation and an error, it is best to protect yourself. So, what we mean to say is, in the general sense, we would not like to seek Islamic knowledge from a who we think has, an approach which is worlds apart from what we want to follow. We want to follow Allah subhanahu, we want to obey Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And our role model is the Prophet sallallahu alayhi wasallam. And the people who tried to exemplify the teachings of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam were the people in the first century of Islam. The early Muslims, the Sahaba. And so this is the general approach that any Muslim yearns to have in their Islam. And of course, anybody who strips away and who snatches away at this basic idea of looking up to the Prophet ﷺ as a role model, why would we look up to them for scholarship and for answers? Why would we look up to people who don't respect the Sahaba in areas where they don't respect the Sahaba? So as a general sense, we wouldn't look to them for knowledge. As to their treatment as Muslims or not, that's a different issue. What we're talking about is seeking knowledge from them and giving them that title of authority in our heart. Now stick to people who are of established principle. This is the fourth criteria. People who respect the tradition, people who rely on the hadith tradition, people who respect the Sahaba, people whose principles are transparent. A great scholar of Islam, Khatib al-Baghdadi, he said, there were rejectionists. There were rejectionists, right? The Rawafid, or those people, who completely denied the authority and the place of the companions of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and the ideological renegades, or the Kharijites, an extreme group of people. He said their fatwa are blameworthy, and their statements are rejected. Their statements are rejected. And of course you have many statements like this from the scholars of Islam. You have people like Imam al-Bukhari, rahimahullah ta'ala, who in his collection of hadith, which is very well known, yes, he had narrators, or he had a hadith, where the narrators in those chains had questionable approaches. People who disrespected the Sahaba. There were people amongst them who were from the Kharijite understanding. There were people who were of different persuasions and different stripes and colors. And he accepted their narrations in those areas where those problems, those deviations did not matter, where it did not affect those issues, as long as they were trustworthy. But in those areas where there was a deviation and an error, and there were vested interests and agendas in those areas, like for example, they would not accept a hadith or a narration, a report from a person who doesn't respect the Sahaba about the virtue of the Sahaba. Does that make sense? In the areas of the virtues and the merits of the Sahaba and who to respect, who not to respect, those kinds of narrations, they would not accept them because there were vested interests involved. There was an agenda. But in other areas, they were a little bit more open-minded. So, the best thing to do as an everyday Muslim is just to not seek knowledge from people who have generally and an overall approach which is blameworthy. Just don't get involved. The scholars will tell you, okay, these are the areas where we can take from them, and they will sift out those areas and they will give it to you. As a lay Muslim, your job, just stay away from it.